Okay, pipe down, pipe down. We're going to get started because the more time we have for Brenda, the better. She has no idea what I'm going to say right now. I'm Nathan Shedroff. I'm the program chair of the MBA in Design Strategy here, and it is an incredible pleasure and actually an honor to introduce this evening one of my personal heroes, Brenda Laurel. And I don't have that, I can't say that about tons of people, so it's amazing to be up here in front of her. I met Brenda back in like 1991 or 1992, I think, right directly after her first talk at TED. She has had two, and I expect a third to come fairly soon. Not many people can claim that. And then I had the pleasure of working on a project of hers back in 1994 called Finding Your Voice, which was this amazing CD-ROM, for those of you that don't know CD-ROMs, because they were like compact discs, only with images. It was a CD-ROM to help young people use theater techniques and principles to discover their voice, to express themselves creatively. It was one of the most interesting and probably rewarding projects I've ever worked on. And it's no accident that it was one of Brenda's projects. I was in awe of her then, especially that first design meeting, and I'm still in awe of her. It was she who introduced me, for instance, to the concept of experience. In fact, I believe she said at the VisCom conference back in 1995, "It's all about experience, stupid." I think she actually said that in her talk. Not to me, to the audience. And she doesn't really know this, but I've been trying to quietly manipulate her career ever since. We know Brenda, of course, as the chair of the MFA program in design, the grad design program here at CCA, but if you're a woman between the ages of 25 and 30, you probably know her, especially if you grew up in the USA, as the person behind Rocket, which was the main character from products from an incredible company called Purple Moon, which all was a result of some incredible research into gender and games and technology back about 15 or 16 years ago. Others know her as the co-founder of Telepresence, which was one of the first virtual reality firms, probably one of the most audacious in Silicon Valley, certainly at the time, and even I think in comparison today. Gaming programmers or gamers, gaming engineers, probably in their 40s and 50s, and maybe even some in their 60s, might know her as the lady programmer, because she was the only woman on the development team and programming at companies like Cybervision and Atari way back when. They used to trot her out at the trade shows, and people would come look at the lady engineer in the booth, which wasn't bad, sort of messaging for them, actually. Best yet, I think her, the things to me that if I were her, I would value the most about her career is that she was immortalized in a comic book, and then she was also immortalized in the book, the Douglas Copeland book, Generation X, for her work that was going on at the time at Interval on girls and gender in computing. And I wish I could find a T-shirt that was described in the book. And so those are some pretty unusual things for an educator and a technologist to experience in their career. She's been an actor, she's been a director, she earned her PhD presciently in theater, not in programming. She's a prolific writer. She wrote The Art of Computer-Human Interface book, which was a standard for years and still hasn't been duplicated. She wrote Computers as Theater, which was essentially her PhD thesis, an incredibly influential book. Design Research, which many of us here probably use as a Bible or have at least read. It's still the standard for design research. And my personal favorite was Utopian Entrepreneur, where she described her experience starting a company, what she had learned from that, and what came of it. And I think it's a great book for anyone that's interested in a startup to read and understand at a personal level what you're going to go through before you get there. She's going to speak today on what I hope becomes her next great book. So we're fortunate enough to see that. And then along the way, she has this incredibly rich personal life. She has 3 incredibly talented, wonderful, beautiful daughters. She has had 2 husbands in serial, not in parallel. And she has one of the most diverse sets of friends that I've ever met. Her community around her that she's assembled is quite extraordinary, and in some ways maybe the best achievement she's ever had. We're fortunate here at CCA to have her because she only works at companies or organizations that start with vowels or C's. Cybervision, Atari, Apple, Activision, EPICS, Interval Research, Art Center, College of Design, and now, of course, CCA. So please welcome Brenda Laurel.
Thank you, Nathan. When I met Nathan, he was a little tiny fellow. He was very young, and he wrote good code. And then he had this company that he would sell and then buy back and then sell and then buy back. It was like feeding goat cheese to goats. It was really amazing. Anyway, Nathan, I had to embarrass you back. So, in 1992, I was a wetware consultant. Looks like this person is having a little trouble with augmented reality here. The project was Oliver Stone's miniseries called Wild Palms, an eminently forgettable but interesting foray into futurism in 1992. And one of the benefits of working on the movie was that I got to appear in the comic book as this character, which is doing something. I mean, she's got a gun, she's got a Lex. It's all unclear what she's doing. And she only shows up once. It's really strange to be in a comic strip. I mean, I love the laptop almost as much as I love the hair in this and the glasses, you know. But she's saying, I'm going to tell you a story. And so I thought I would start there and say, I'm going to tell you a story. And it's about, you know, my life in art, actually. It's about the 35 years I've spent in the interaction design business. And some of the things I'm trying to pull together as a systematic way of looking at interactive media, especially along the vector of authorship, who makes it, who is responsible for the final experience. And I want to start actually with a story about something that happened long before I was born. This is a picture through the periscope of the USS Wahoo, captained by Dudley Mush Morton in World War II. On January 26, 1943, the Wahoo torpedoed and sank a Japanese transport. And that's what we're seeing here. Morton felt that looking through that periscope was too immersive for him to do his job as a captain. And so he assigned the job of looking through the periscope to his XO, a guy named Richard O'Kane. And his XO would look through the periscope and tell Mush what he was seeing because it was just overwhelming. He couldn't do it. And that's a very interesting thing. So this is by way of introducing you to some of the vectors that I'm using in my analysis of authorship and interactive media. So if we look here, the technology is the periscope. The action is looking around, scanning in a prescribed way the scene. The actors are the captain and then the XO. The senses are vision, certainly, but also kinesthesia, proprioception. The cultural element is the culture of war, the culture of the Navy. And the element of nature is sea and weather conditions. And what comes up then is something we'd call emergence, where there's this emergent behavior that no one would have expected when they designed a periscope, where the guy using it finds it too immersive to handle and delegates the task to someone else and has them speak about it. It's kind of an emergent behavior. So those are the vectors that I'm going to use throughout this talk for looking at interaction design and the question of who authors the experience. What are the forces at work in the shape of the final experience of an interaction? So to finish this tale, the Wahoo performed 7 war patrols between August 42 and October 43, won 6 battle stars for its performance. And in this truly eerie moment, Mush Morton put his XO O'Kane off on a dock before he took off on their, what was to be their last tour, and they never returned. O'Kane alone survived to tell the tale of what happened to the ship. The wreckage was found in 2006. So that's strange. I'm going to fast forward to 1968. By then, I am alive. I am a senior in high school. I'm ready to rock and roll. And everything else you'll see here happens while I'm alive. This handheld image of Earth from space was captured on the Apollo 8 moon mission. I was 18. Life magazine popularized that image by putting it on the cover. And then more things happened. Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog launched that same year. This moment of seeing the Earth through that photograph is what I would call a hinge, looking at those attributes. So a hinge is a moment in which things change in a highly significant way, and in this case, in the domain of interaction design. So this is a hinge that clearly has cultural implications. It's based on a new vision of nature. It sparked an emergent change in global consciousness. In his book, Myths to Live By, in 1972, Joseph Campbell described the effect of that first image of Earth from space taken by a human being as being the moment when we suddenly understood that rather than coming into this world, we come out of it. So there was a profound thing that happened there. You know, and at the same time, Nixon's thinking about the EPA, go figure, right? Okay, so here, starting with Mush Morton's periscope and the Apollo 8 photo of Earth, those are two entries on a list I've made with the help of many friends and colleagues and students that represent to me what seem to be milestones in authorship and interaction design. So the events I've listed and the values I've given them on this chart, according to one of those 8 dimensions, any of them, is highly subjective. And I offer this as a preliminary attempt to understand these inventions and how the forces behind them and the forces behind the authorship of the experiences that they produced changes over time. And I invite you to help me populate this chart, because I'm going to focus on things that I actually personally had some awareness of or that I was involved in. So I guess the first obvious question is, what does it mean to be an author? And I would say it is an agent, human, otherwise, or collective, that shapes the whole experience. I say interactive experience here, but when you think about books, you know, this is kind of reader response theory on steroids, because we're talking about an interactive situation where what a player or a user or an interactor can do actually changes the shape of the whole thing. So that person becomes a time-displaced co-author with whoever else worked on the piece. Aristotle said that authorship, he defined authorship as the efficient cause of the whole action in a play, or in this case, an interactive experience. And in his definition, he included both the author, again, maybe a person, a non-person, a collective, and their tools. Starts to be interesting later on. So in a way, authorship in interactive media is an umbrella for these various components. And of course, behind software, you have programmers, and behind hardware, you have engineers. So there's already a collective involved in interactive media. And in many ways, what we're seeing is the role of the interactors and the natural world and emergence as kind of the up-and-coming phenomena that change over time. Cybervision was my first gig in interactive media. It exemplifies a lot of what was happening during the gestation period of interactive personal computing around the mid-1970s. The new affordances that were created for interaction during this time would shape everything that came after. So it's the hinge here around cybervision is the technology for interaction. That is a technology where a player or a user could make a response and have a program respond back to it in a domestic or pop culture situation, and the kind of action that could occur, right? what kind of choices could that person make? That seems really obvious, and yet, when you think about what was going on at this moment in time, the most interactive thing we could do was change the channel on the TV. Interaction as a notion, as a discipline, did not exist in this period of time. So we could watch the glistening eye of CBS or the beautiful little font of ABC or the peacock of NBC. I remember the day that they said on Captain Kangaroo that the show was going to be in color. And mine stayed black and white. And I'm still pissed off. This is just not okay with me. Anyway, many years after that horrible event with Captain Kangaroo, a friend of mine named Joe Miller, who was working at the Battelle Memorial Research Institute on Imagery coming in from space, took me over to see his lab late at night under the influence of herbal medicine. And we went up several floors to this room of monitors, and I saw images from space painting themselves on the screen, and I literally fell to my knees, and I said, whatever this is, I have to have a piece of it, you know. The world changed. I was working on a PhD in theater. I was like, what was I thinking, right? This is incredibly cool. So this company was called Cybervision, and basically it was an 1802 processor. These were the processors that were used in the early space program because they were highly tolerant of cold, the cold of space. Its I/O device was an alphanumeric keypad, strangely reminiscent of texting. It had a 256 by 192 pixel display. So we're talking really fat bits, right? With 4 colors, fat bits. Programs were loaded from cassette tape at 200 baud. For those of you who are old enough to know what baud means, that's really slow. Into 2K of usable RAM. Now, it's sort of like bees. You hear the story that they fly because they don't know they can't, right? Well, I lip-synced a snake with 18 mouth positions and 2K of RAM. Okay. The cool thing about this was that you could synchronize audio coming from the tape with what was happening on the screen by putting little sub-auditory cues in that would tell the computer to do something. But there was no way that players could make any kind of significant decision, because you could only load 2K worth of code into this little sucker. When you came to the next load, you had to start at a converging node. In other words, it couldn't be different from the beginning point of each segment of code had to be the same. So you could make little insignificant choices, but the memory of the computer couldn't save anything big, like let's kill the king now, you know. You just got to change the color of the flowers in the garden or something like that. So it got me thinking, what is this thing we're calling interaction? There must be more than that. They hired me to design and build interactive fairy tales. And the cool thing about that was that in those days, interactive theater was really happening, right? Interactive theater was happening on Broadway. I was producing interactive plays, and you know, in the Green at Ohio State, we had kids running around in Robin Hood and stuff. So it didn't seem weird to me at all to make an interactive story. What seemed weird was that you couldn't make a significant choice. And when they came in with like a 16K version of this thing, we thought, oh God, what are we going to do, War and Peace? Ha ha. What are we going to do with 16K? That's crazy. So we sold like 10,000 of these puppies at Montgomery Wards, but then there was this new kid on the block that showed up out in California, Atari. And one by one, this evil genius drew each of us from Cybervision to California. I remember coming out for my interview and staying at some motel in Sunnyvale, and I said, where's the ocean? Because I'd never seen it. And the guy said, well, we just take this little road called Highway 17. Here I am, from Ohio. It's like, I'm going to die. And it was, an hour and a half of this. And then I got to the Santa Cruz Harbor, and it was like, oh, cool, I'll get some shrimp. I've seen the ocean. Not. Anyway, Atari was the next stop for me, and that was a whole different story. But I want to bring your attention to some other things that were going on at the same time. Even though I'm not going to descend into projects I didn't work on, it is worth noting that Andrew Lippman and Michael Neymark and their compatriots were creating this at MIT. This is the Aspen movie map, where they literally filmed every possible turn in the city and created a video disc where you could navigate around the city of Aspen. This is academically famous. This is making a lot of money right now. right? And that's how it works, guys. It's a 30-year problem. Or, you know, maybe shorter now, but it was a 30-year problem then. And I consider myself to be one of the world's most experienced crash dummies. I'm sure there are other people, my colleagues in this room, who could say that. But back to Atari. The Atari 400 computer showed up 7 years after the Atari game machine. Sorry, 7 years after the Alto, 4 years after the Atari game machine. The Alto was the first personal computer. It was developed at Xerox PARC. The Atari 2600 game machine appeared in '76, and the 400 appeared in 1980, and I was the first woman hired there. So I can remember in my first day of work, I got a cubicle and a phone, no desk. I'm sitting on the floor, right, and I remember I had to go to the bathroom, so I went over to the women's room, and I opened the door, and blue smoke billows out, and there are all these long-haired guys in tie-dye sitting on the floor passing a joint, and I said, dudes, you know, I like really have to use the bathroom. I need you to get out of here. So that's the kind of place that Atari was. Nevertheless, great stuff got done. So the hinge for me around the Atari machines, as well as the contemporaries of the 400, like the Amiga, later on the Commodore 64, were the effects at the level of both technology and culture. We got into more sophisticated applications at that point, and we had a huge effect in popular culture, so that the notion of interactivity and what people expected of interactive experiences were highly shaped by this moment in time. And so that's why I would call it a hinge. The prevailing wisdom at Atari when I got there was to port games from the game machine over to the computer. And I can remember that I almost got fired several times, but the first time was because the president wanted me to spend 80% of my software budget porting Ms. Pac-Man. You know, so I like broke into the office of the president of the computer division and said, look, dude, you know, how are we going to differentiate this product if it's playing the same software? How about banking and personal finance and programming languages and education? And he sits there and he goes, your salary's doubled, you report to me, you hired, you know, so it was cool. And that lasted about a year, and then they came after me again, but that's another story. All right, so we were trying to figure out what a home computer was besides a clone of a video game machine, and we'd heard about these guys down the street called Apple that were doing interesting stuff, and they were giving away computers to schools. So we had some competition. I built a group at Atari to look at applications in those areas that I mentioned. So you're looking here at Atari Music Maker. This is on the 800. We did VisiCalc. I had a memorable meeting with Richard Simmons when Atari decided they wanted to do personal fitness on the computer. I went down there, he's like this little dude with curly hair, and he's like, ooh, ooh, Energizer Bunny sort of thing, and luckily the company decided the personal liability issues were, you know, made it such that maybe we didn't want to do that, so. Yeah, so as I was reaching for the door the second time they came gunning for me because I was resistant to spending all my money on games, I met this dude here, this dude, Alan Kay. He was poached by Warner from Xerox PARC, where he had invented the Smalltalk language. He had done remarkable pioneering work, and they recruited him to head up the new Atari Systems Research Lab in 1981. Now, I personally think, you know, he had made his difference, and they were offering ridiculous amounts of money, and like, who wouldn't do that, you know? So he came over, and he was gone a lot, but we got a lot of really interesting work done, including making up a director for the lab that didn't exist, and getting him like paid, and giving teleconferences and stuff. We didn't even know, we thought we were just goofing. That turned out to be kind of important. Anyway, this lab and this work changed my life. And one of the reasons, of course, was the other people besides Alan Kay who are in this lab, and some of them are in this room. So the hinge at this time, at least in my experience, was the beginnings of thoughts about artificial intelligence and expert systems as ways to author more robust interactive platforms. In other words, having computational affordances be part of the authorship team of interactive experiences, so we could get beyond the branching tree into things that were more subtle and complex and emotionally pleasing. And so Alan brought some of the really smart people from the Media Lab and from MIT's architecture program to come work at the Atari Lab, and that's how I met my colleague Rachel Strickland and the father of my children, Eric Kalteen, and Scott Fisher, and a bunch of people whose names you'll hear over and over, Michael Neymark, who did the Aspen Media Map. All these guys came together and worked in this amazing spot. Here's Alan talking about the Dynabook. Now, this may started to flicker in some of the older people's minds here. The Dynabook was this idea. It really looks like a laptop now, but remember, this is coming up for him, I think, in like 1972 or something. He started talking about it. It was a tablet computer. He thought of its audience as being kids. And he wanted them to be able to go out and use it in the natural world as something that would help them with their education and their learning and their pleasure of nature. My work in Alan's lab eventually morphed into my PhD thesis. So by now you notice I speak a lot about computer games, and this is a little reminder, the most salient affordances for interesting new interaction have always come out of the computer game business. They've always been a step ahead. I can't think of a time when that wasn't true, at least as long as there have been computer games around, and that really starts with Space War about 1967, so they're always leading. And that's because in a game, the interaction is the experience. It's the whole shot. You know, that's what you're selling when you sell a computer game, an experience that is interactive. And it's not about some other thing like balancing your checkbook. It's about having fun with interaction. At the Atari Lab, I want to give this picture because I think it's an interesting counterpoint. This was the Dynabook Vision project that we worked on, and this is a little girl taking the Dynabook out into the natural world to identify birds. Again, you know, the 30-year rule obtains the crash dummy moment for all of us. Atari went under shortly thereafter because they produced a bunch of really crappy games. Do you know about this? They got the license to E.T. and they produced really bad games because the guys from Warner were like brain dead and they thought a good license was all it took. And these games were so bad that they buried like 60,000 of them in concrete in the desert in Arizona. And some kids were riding their bikes and they started finding these cartridges and all hell broke loose. People were arrested. It was really exciting. And that's when a $2 billion company just went to shit because Warner always thought it was a fad. Oh, I have more to say about that. Actually, I met Davis Masson, Christopher Ireland's significant other, at Atari in a brainstorming session during these days. And one of the people who was there was Stuart Brand. And Stuart Brand said that computer games were, and I quote, a fad like jogging. I bet he's really sorry somebody remembers that. Before I go on, I want to step back. I want to step back 2 years to 1980, because way outside of the orbit of Silicon Valley, there were these people down in Los Angeles, Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz, and they had an organization called the Electronic Cafe International, and they'd done some amazing work over the years. In the 60s, they'd done teleconference dance concerts between the Soviet Union and the United States on satellite. They did an amazing networking project with ethnic families in Los Angeles during the Olympics. Well, in 1980, they were doing some grassroots research, and they built this thing called A Hole in Space, which was an audacious hack based on satellites, cameras, duct tapes, and a bit of craziness. Hole in Space was important for many reasons, but the most striking thing was the emergent behavior that happened. Let me show you. So without any public announcement, they installed a hole in a sidewalk-facing window at New York City's Lincoln Center and in a display window at the Broadway department store in Century City. So both of these displays could accommodate at least 15 people, and you see they've got more by this time. You could hear what was being said at the other side at the volume of a conversation. The first night, people just walked by and said, "What?" And by talking, realized that they were talking to people in a different city. And then it showed up on the news, and a bunch more people came. And by the third time, people were driving from long distances and holding up babies and getting married on this thing. And then it was over because it was art. There you go. Back to the plan here. Rodney Brooks, by the way, is worth a mention, even though I didn't work with him. Both Rob and I were involved with his lab. He was developing something called subsumption architecture. I don't want to go into it too much, but at the time, the king of AI was Marvin Minsky. And his notion basically was to model the human brain, that artificial intelligence consisted of modeling not only what the brain does, but how it does it. And Brooks, by contrast, said, we just want to see the outcomes. The mechanism doesn't matter so much, we want to see the behavior. And so subsumption architecture in the early days used an insectoid model where a leg would move and it would tell the next leg, you better move. And there was no central nervous system running the show. But these robots were so incredibly agile and smart that paradigm for a robot has lasted. I mean, it's got its little tendrils in the Mars rover and stuff. And eventually Brooks won that little battle. I want to talk about Habitat. Habitat was, again, a bystander because I was producing Lucasfilm games for Activision at this point, so I got to hang out with the boys up at the ranch. It's so cool. You go into the cafeteria and there's Ron Howard at lunch, and what do you say? I knew you when you were a little kid. No. It's really embarrassing, really embarrassing. Anyway, Habitat. These guys were studying chat rooms and multiplayer games that were text-based online. And to calibrate, Werner Vinge had written his amazingly canonical story, True Names, 5 years before Habitat. Neuromancer by William Gibson was 3 years before Habitat. These were the main guys who were envisioning everything we would call virtual reality or augmented reality. And the boys at Lucasfilm said, okay, let's just do this thing, And so their hinge involved the kinds of actions that could occur, the actors, the culture, and again, emergent behavior. It's so interesting. In the realm of gaming, designers were beating their heads against the problem of coming up with good non-player characters during this period. How can we design a character that's intelligent enough or intelligent seeming enough to provide a real good challenge to a player? And there was all this work in AI and non-player characters. And then the boys at LucasArts said, well, wait, what could be more interesting than a non-player character? Other people, son of a bitch. So here we have a networked graphical system produced by Lucasfilm. Most of the players were in Japan and the United States. Again, people are getting married. They're doing crazy stuff. One of the problems was that when you logged off, your character would stay where it was, but other people could come and hack it. So they put you in the toilet or turn you upside down in the park. You have to go find your body when you log back on. So that was kind of a fun little emergent gameplay thing. They offered virtual costumes, so you could dress yourself as anybody you wanted. It was really the beginning of what we now think of as role-playing games. The Worlds of Warcraft stuff started here, and you could say it started sooner, but I think it started here. So all over the map, something amazing. Now we're in 1989. We're looking at 3 years later. We're looking at SIGGRAPH, which is the ACM Conference for Computer Graphics. And in 1989, something amazing happened at SIGGRAPH. Sally Rosenthal is a person who produced many of the video shows at SIGGRAPH, which was the real reason why people went to SIGGRAPH, was to see the video shows. And she had been working with these people, Lauren and Rachel Carpenter, and they had a company called Cinematrix, and I think of it as a really important hinge. So the system provided large group interaction. What happened was you were given a little paddle. It was a shiny green color on one side and a shiny red on the other. Okay, so you could turn the paddle in response to questions or things that were happening. And then there was a camera looking out at those reflective paddles and then reflecting on the screen the pattern that those paddles were making. So immediately, within 10 minutes, they had us playing a pretty good game of Pong. We're talking 5,000 people, right? You didn't have to know where you were. This was like swarm intelligence for humans. It was the most amazing thing. By the end of it, this audience kind of almost landed a plane in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Kind of almost. There was a crash, but it was a near miss. This blew my mind, that a group of people who didn't know where they were in relation to each other or the dots on the screen could manifest that kind of behavior in such a short period of time. Truly an emergent moment, and we'll see it showing up again later with participatory sensing, which is a much more contemporary thing. So the hint here is technology, nature, and emergence, right? There's something going on with this technology that augments something about human nature that allows us to behave as a group in a way that's unexpected, unpredictable. To me, that's an important hinge in our history. We saw a lot of really important stuff in 4 short years there. HyperCard was, as some of you old folks know, a tool for making tools and making interactive stuff. SimCity, the notion that you had an interactive simulation with nested interactive simulations inside of it, right? Turtles all the way down. And that all of those became parts of the authorship team, in addition to the humans who were playing the game. My husband Rob teaches me that this idea of the little nested entity that can take independent behavior depends on 3 things: that it has perception, that it can form an internal representation of what's going on at some level, and that it can take action on the basis of that representation. So there's a kind of autonomy about what we would call an entity. And you see them big time in SimCity. Again, you can look at models in the realm of academic computer science and find other examples of this, but in terms of popular culture, this is where it hits the road, in terms of little entities working inside of each other. In Tiananmen Square, people were using email and faxes to communicate with each other and to publicize a revolution that we would not otherwise have known was happening. Now just think about what that's got in common with Cinematrix. Just think about it. This is, it's deeper than deep for me anyway. In order to keep talking about what I actually did, I'm going to skip ahead to virtual reality. Telepresence Research was, I think, the second company I started in my crash dummy persona. I brought together a bunch of really great people and technologies, and it really changed the kinds of actions that people might take in VR. You got to remember, at this stage of the game, VR was used for training astronauts, training people to drive, big machinery. Period. We were fooling around with other things we might do. We didn't get there with telepresence. Rachel and I and Rob got there later, and Mike. But we got the head-mounted display from NASA. What happened was I found some money, and I went and got Scott Fisher and dragged him out of NASA and started a company. Dumb. Had no idea I needed a CEO. MBA kids, first thing you do, hire a CEO who knows what they're doing. We had Mark Bolas, Fake Space Labs, Boom Viewer. We had wonderful Rachel Strickland, Michael Neymark. Convolvatron sound was three-dimensional spatialized sound, which turns out to be really important in virtual reality. If you just got stereo sound, if you turn your head, and you're listening to the band goes over there. I can remember some Grateful Dead tapes where the band, went up in the air because I turned my head I had microphones here. But with spatialized sound, we're tracking where your head's going, so the noise is always coming from the right place. That became a really important element of virtual reality. After telepresence kind of tanked, because it was, after all, about 30 years ahead of a time when it might actually make some money, Rachel and I decided we would, I keep pointing over here because Rachel usually sits over here, but she's not over here. Where are you, Rachel? In the middle. Hi, Rachel. Okay. Rachel and I had misbehaved many times together before this. We worked on a project at Apple with the character of Coyote, trying to learn about how children might use narrative to do programming. We'd done a bunch of stuff. We built a proposal for this thing called Placeholder. And a bunch of people that we'd already collaborated with worked on it: Michael Neymark, Steve Saunders, John Harrison, who went on to work with Shar Davies in VR, and my own future life partner, Rob Tao, who spent much time in a windowless room writing lots of code. as is appropriate for programmers. So our goal with Placeholder was to be able to tell a story about what virtual reality could do that was different from the sort of dry training stuff that we were seeing, because we were seeing these like dazzling implications of what this medium was capable of. So in this hinge, all the vectors light up. Everything lights up. Everything changes, at least for us and for me, and I think for history. We made some unique contributions, Placeholder itself, to the VR hinge. While the head-mounted display was really well established and people were rendering things with polygons, we were going out and taking video of places and making tiled domes. We used several different ways of capturing the natural world. The system itself was hellishly complex because we were trying to do so much that hadn't been done before. I think there were 13 or 14 computers, from the #1 Silicon Graphics reality engine all the way to a Macintosh PowerBook and a lot of duct tape. So one of our helper cats, Steve Saunders, developed a thing called a grippy that allowed, in virtual reality, you had a glove. Do you remember this? The glove? So you would point the way you were going, and you would walk like this and go that way, and then you would have other hand jive that you could do that would make things happen. If you had two hands, you could do all kinds of stuff, right? And that sort of symbolic language went away. The other thing that changed in terms of action is that in old school VR, action was intended direction of action was taken from the head-mounted display. We put a sensor on the pelvis so that you took the intended direction of action from the pelvis and the gaze from the helmet. So instead of this, you got this, right? You got your body back. That's so nice, so nice. One of the problems with action, and I think we were the first to do two-person stuff. One of the things about action, I've told my students this already, was we had a crow that was supposed to be able to fly. You could enter the character of crow. And I went around doing my design research, asking people how they fly in their dreams. And some people would say, I do this, and some people would say that. Boys would say, I do this. They would make this little hydrofoil thing. It's like, oh, no, my God, I'm never going to figure this out. And then I realized, wait, everybody knows what this is, right? So I went and told Rob, and he said, well, then we have to teach the computer about time, because understanding what a flap is depends on understanding time. So it was a big, hairy problem, but it was great how it turned out. I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this because my students have seen it. But in this hinge, what you're seeing, the two animals are virtual costumes. There were actually 4 creatures you could enter into. And when you got into the creature, it changed your perception, the way you could move around. So you got this sense of having to opt into a body. There was a big controversy at the time about embodiment in VR. Men would tell you that they felt out of body, and women would say they were taking their bodies to a different place, generally speaking. So we said, okay, you got to choose a body. Get in there. So Russell Zeidner, who's here with Rachel, did the graphic design for this piece. This is the map. And this is really about the cultural piece of the hinge, about telling the story. We modeled a natural landscape with magical affordances. And we modeled a landscape that was where we were. So what we were doing was, you know, some people would say, well, why are you doing that? That's just objectifying nature. And it was like, no, dude, this is like indexical to nature. This is pointing at nature saying, look over here. There are stories in these rocks. There are faces in these clouds, right? You know, our brains let us do that. Let's do it with this technology, too. So it was a really kind of sharp left turn, I'd say, for the discipline of VR, and I'm really proud we did it. On we go. Oh, you guys haven't seen this, have you? Some of you haven't seen this. Is Crow flying. I'm not getting his audio. Oh, too bad. He's screaming. Oh, here he goes. So we're seeing him from the outside. Then we altered the pitches of the voices so the animals would know who they were. He's going down the waterfall. He's strafing down. This is Sean White. You'll see him again in the presentation. I was the guy who tested the flying to calibrate it, and the first time it was like, you'd get like 3 inches off the ground, you know. And then they'd fix it, and I'd go poof, and up out of the model, like, so it'd be this little dot down there. And so when we came home, I had these really terrific muscles, like in my armpits from all the flying. Okay, good. This is Shar Davies' piece, Osmose, that was done a few years later. And again, people reported extraordinary transformative experiences from being in this virtual world. She devised an interface device that was based on breathing. And she took her model from diving, so you went up by inhaling and down by exhaling. And within 30 minutes in the system, people looked like they were doing Tai Chi. It was really neat. It was on exhibit at the museum in Toronto and various other places. One of the things you don't see on this chart is interval research. And that's because the lab actually, well, it funded most of Placeholder, but so many things happened there, you can't actually just talk about the lab. You have to talk about the projects. And I won't go into many. Interval co-funded Placeholder. One of the projects, Rob and Rachel and Steve and Mike and I worked there together. And again, that's a lesson, I guess, to everybody, that you will, I imagine, roll with pretty much the same people throughout your career. You'll just keep seeing them again. So it's worth, you know, making those relationships go through the periods that you're not working together, because you'll need them. You'll want to reach out to them. Something will come up. That'll be the guy, you know. You want to be able to get on the phone. Anyway, my job after Placeholder at Interval was to do research on gender and technology. And again, I apologize for those of you who have already heard about this. I'll try to make it short. I was able to set my own course, and we did 4 years of research on gender differences. And then we deployed that research in the design of games that were for girls. Because at this period of time, there weren't any games that girls really liked to play very much, with the possible exception of Pac-Man. And the word on the street was that girls liked Pac-Man because it was about an eating disorder. All right, I got to calm down. I'm sorry. So here's some stuff from the design research. We had kids take pictures of their bedrooms, and we were able to find segmentation, if you will. I know I've told my students, don't use words that dismember people. We were able to find different kinds of girls that you could cluster together by looking just at their bedrooms and how they arranged them. And we had them show us all kinds of other aspects of their lives, like their treasures, their clothing, the times when they thought they were playing, with photo audits. And then we also did a lot of work with them with probes, taking things out into the field, asking them to do puppet shows, et cetera. All told, we interviewed over 1,000 kids between the ages of 8 and 14, and about 500 adults. It's interesting, some of the differences we've learned about were brain-based, biological differences. And in the 80s, you may not remember this, but you weren't allowed to talk about that. That was not okay. The feminists would have you, and they would hang you out to dry. And I'm a feminist, so I can say that. But there are actually some brain-based differences that make a difference when you're doing interaction design. Mental rotation. Girls are fairly less able to do that under time pressure than boys. That's imagining a thing in a different orientation. So when you see those "you are here" fire maps in a building, if that sucker is rotated 90 degrees, the women will die in the fire. That's what that means. Women who are really good at Tetris, we say, well, but how can that be? There are some women who are champs at Tetris. It's because when you interview them, they're turning that, they're reframing it as a pattern matching problem. And that's something that female brains excel at, which is just interesting. So we learned a bunch of stuff about culture and brain-based differences, and we built a bunch of games that did pretty well, and then our investors smelled the internet and saw that there were companies with huge valuations that didn't even have business plans. And gosh, when you've got real goods in a warehouse, you know, your revenue is only going to be max 10x of your net worth is 10x of your annual revenue. And wouldn't it be a better investment to go throw money at these invisible people with no? And so they shut the doors on us, and we were acquired by Mattel, which ran off and killed us and every other player in the girl game market. But then the next year, Mattel died. Their interactive group died. It was like a boa that ate an animal that was too big, you know, because they'd swallowed all these properties and they couldn't service them, so their interactive division blew up and their president got fired. And I was sitting at home steaming, trying to write a best-selling nasty mean book, but I came up with a nicer one. One of the things we pioneered in that was the notion of being able to navigate emotionally. So these are rollovers where the character is giving you thoughts, and you're going to decide how you feel about what happens next. There was no way to win these games. So this is a new kind of emotional affordance for interactive authorship. A girl could guide herself through this and shape her own experience by navigating emotionally. In another series of games that was more about the natural world, we used the typical sort of treasure hunt pattern, but we also used folk tales. We extruded the magic stones into the real world. This was before I was aware that plastic was evil. We had a wonderful website that was getting more hits than Disney for a long time, so there's lots of bragging that could go on here. After it was all over and I got through being angry, I wrote what I hope was a kind of sensible book about what I learned from it all. This being my third startup, I really had no excuse for failing yet again. So at that point, I sort of got it out of my system and drifted away from games. And so we're getting to the thrilling conclusion here. It's not like the world quit changing when I got out of the rat race. I became a distinguished engineer at Sun Labs. I think they had a shortage of women. But I did get to see the development of a new technology called sunspots. And these were little Turing-complete computers, little, I don't know, ARM9s? ARM7s, that you could arrange in distributions and write programs whereby the little sensors would talk to each other and take action depending on what the group was communicating about. And there were all kinds of things you could do with these. Rob and his buddies designed a system for tracking packages that accidentally fell off the back of Blockbuster trucks. Some of my students at Art Center built semi-intelligent blimps out of them. But a whole new world opened up of distributed computing where you could sort of put stuff in the air, in the environment around you, and see what would happen. The distributed computing movement, some of you may have heard of this, was really exemplified by SETI at home, where you would give over the cycles of your computer for the course of the time that you weren't using it during the day, and those cycles would be used to look for traces of intelligent life in the universe. And then that notion, that paradigm came to be used for all kinds of stuff, protein folding, weather modeling, stuff that's really too complex even for big giant mainframes to do. So these were, again, it's echoes of Cinematrix, huge problems, people who don't know each other, who don't know where each other are, working on their piece of a very large pie that can't be solved in any other way. It starts to become a very interesting piece of authorship. I worked on Swarm Intelligence. This turned out to be a canonical book for computer scientists, those of you who know about it. And then I read Lovelock's Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, which completely changed my understanding of biology and evolution. And thanks to the tutelage of my husband, I was able to start indulging myself in my interest in science, and particularly in evolutionary theory, which takes me to this book, Symbiotic Planet by Lynn Margulis. She makes an incredibly persuasive case that the primary cause of speciation is not descent with modification, but what she calls symbiogenesis. That is, beings that are symbiotic becoming one and dropping the genes that they don't need because they're working together now as a single organism. That is the mechanism that gave us the three major parts of cells, right? In every cell of a living being, you'll find a chloroplast, or you'll find a flagella, or you'll find, as you do in us, a mitochondrion. And there's this way in which this has deep resonance with how technology evolves, symbiogenesis, things dropping the genes they don't need. So when you think about photography becoming digital, you hook the computer to the camera and the darkroom genes fall off and the film genes fall off. It's a wonderful strategy for thinking about how we can, it's a strategy for authorship in interactive media, how we can make new things. By looking at this notion of symbiogenesis, whether it's involving the player or user as one of the symbiotes, or other systems that actually already exist. So this book changed my life. Meanwhile, then little things are crawling around everywhere. We're up around the 2000s now. The Sims are crawling around the web in their own little environment, and Rod Brooks' decentralized flavor of AI triumphs, and he becomes head of the MIT engineering team and has a company called iRobot, and now he's got a company called Heartland Robot that's looking at building robots to replace stoop labor in agriculture. Howard Rheingold wrote Smart Mobs, so we're looking at this sort of group intelligence that we saw in the Cinematrix example. And we see the tragic but valiant Green Revolution in Iran showing us the thing that happens after the network of communications that existed during the Tiananmen Square Revolution. So a lot happens really, really fast here. I just talked about all these. I'll go through them quickly. So here, if I pull out and look at this little chromatograph, this is what I've been showing you. And there's some general things that you can notice about this. Technology changes tend to precede changes in affordances for action, right? The technology changes before the action changes. That's logical. You can count on that being true. Changes in actors, that is, who is interacting with the system, either in number or kind, is less related to changes in action than to changes in culture. I mean, you have to go back and think about this, and think about it in terms of the examples that you know. The way authorship involves changes in the senses happens less frequently, but when it does, it usually makes a bunch of stuff light up on this graph. So you can assume that when you're touching a new sensory space, some large innovation may be more likely to happen. When nature gets into the game as part of the authorship scenario, we see emergence, almost always, from Mush-Morton's telescope on down the line. Emergence is more likely to happen when you have some aspect of natural behavior at play, whether it be the natural world or human nature. And I think this is probably a cyclic pattern. I think it probably repeats itself. It might even be fractal. But I think it's really interesting that there's a pattern at all, and I would invite you to add to it. So quickly, to wrap up. Last thing I'm going to dive into is a project that the guy who was playing the Crow game developed. His name is Sean White. He has a PhD from Columbia. He's right now he's a high EPOPed researcher at Nokia. The project is called the Electronic Field Guide, and it was developed between in a collaboration between Columbia, Smithsonian, and University of Maryland back in 2007 and 2008. And it makes for really interesting building blocks for the future. One component of the objective of the project was to build technology that would help botanists and plant scientists study plants and plant ecosystems better. Okay, and one component of it was a piece called LeafView. This is a piece of software that recognizes the species of a leaf, mostly by looking at the edge pattern and the veination, because those turn out to be more telling than any other attribute of the leaf. And at least 50% of the time, this program is right on its first guess in identifying the plant. Go back to that little girl with her Dynabook, right? The 30-year rule. Sean has that application running on an iPhone now, and I'm hoping that he'll be up for the spring symposium to show it to us. So LeafView presented its information to the scientists that used it in various ways. Some scientists who were using it got the information on hardened tablets. So there are sensors near plants or arrays of plants, and there's a distributed array of sensors. The data from those sensors is showing up for some scientists on a hardened tablet. For other scientists, it's showing up on an augmented reality display as a transparent overlay. So it's over the real-time picture, like you're looking through glasses that have text of what that sensor is putting out. Here's what's cool. When Sean asked these scientists to explain what they thought the system was doing, the scientists who had the tablet said, well, the information is coming from the sensors. It's being transmitted to the CPU in my computer. It's being transformed into a representation, and I'm looking at it. The scientists who were looking at the same data through augmented reality displays said, the information is coming from the plant. So when you collapse the perceived cognitive distance in an interface, you get a direct experience that's incredibly riveting, at least in this case, and I find this incredibly provocative as we think about the future. There's something, as Lovelock might say, there's something really Gaian going on here, where people feel that the plants are talking to them. It's just run-of-the-mill botanists. They're not smoking anything. They're looking through this display. And so I guess I want to end with this notion of a Gaian hinge, because I think that that work presages something that starts to look at the whole earth and the natural world and our relationship to it in a different way, that starts to enable us to have different eyes on the world, as we have so many times before, just as that Apollo image from space. The technology for a Gaian interface is likely to involve distributed sensors, participatory sensing, augmented reality displays, satellites, massive feedback for our senses, collaborative work where you don't need to know where you are in relation to everybody else, to think about and work on and play with a very large representation. The actors will include a great many people as well as many aspects of the natural world. And if this hinge is actualized, it will create emergence at the level of individual consciousness, just like that picture of Earth from space did. It will create emergence at the level of culture, just as that picture of Earth from space did. It will change by orders of magnitude the way we can collaborate with each other as authors of interactive experience, and with our planet. So authorship will be shared across all the bands if this vision comes true, as it has at all the other canonical hinges in the past. But there's a profound difference in the scale and the actors that we think we're addressing when we're thinking about Gaian interaction design. So I ask you, as the future designers of this world, what if we just step up to that? What if we just up-level to that? What if we start thinking about interaction design at the planetary level? How does that change what we can do about global warming? How does it change our notion of Gaian gardening and taking care of the earth that we live on? There's so much possible that we haven't even done yet. As Lynn Margulis says, Gaia is just symbiosis as seen from space. At this Gaian hinge, I think we can see not only where, but who we are, and I really hope I live to see that. Thank you. Thanks. I'm sorry it's been so hot. It's awful in here. It's not just me, right? It is just me? Shh. By the way, I am following up on this. This is just out, a Gaian Interaction Design article in Interactions Magazine, and you can also find it on my website. And I'm going to pursue this research. There's a book here, or 2 or 6. This is what I'm doing now. Okay. Do you want to do Q&A? Where's Nathan? Nathan? Do we have time? Anybody got anything? I mean, you can say mean things too. That's okay. But don't. Yes?
I just have a comment, Brenda. It seems like your list is sort of paralleling Rosanne Cash's new, the 100 songs that you're supposed to know. So is there any way that you
I love Rosanne.
can publish this and make it available to us so that we can start knowing the...
The list is up on my CCA faculty page, so you can look at it and send me stuff that you want to add. I'd like to put it up as a spreadsheet, but I'm afraid it'll get broken. So send me stuff and I'll add it. It'll be fun. Thank you for asking. But no, Rosanne Cash played no part in this. Yeah.
I was interested in the color chart. Can you describe to us how those colors are filled in, and are they relevant to the data, or is it kind of a made-up thing?
No, I just made it all up. So the colors for each band, there were 3 shades. There's a dark, a medium, and a light. And so when I look at a particular piece, say Habitat, what's going to brighten up is stuff like agents, actors, because that's a salient piece of what Habitat is about. That's what makes it important.
Right. So you picked the color assignment. Because being a female, I was looking at like the relationships as you were talking about and trying to line them up. Whether that was, you know, if the colors were in relationship to, you know, what the meaning was.
Oh yeah, no, I actually tried not to do that because I was afraid I would confuse people, although emergence is green. I'm sure,
I'm just wondering if it's like your assignment and it's not.
it's my assignment. It's subjective, although I imagine you could find evidence to support most of those calls, but I desperately need help in information design, so if you want to volunteer, we can get rid of those little checkerboards and do something better. Yes?
I'm curious how the game of Plum works. How the game of Plum was
Oh.
50,000 people were how many that was?
As I recall it, Lauren said, okay, we fooled around a bit. The guys on the left of the main aisle go green, and you'd get a little bit of feedback. So you kind of knew that you were on the right side. And then he said, okay, people on the left form a line. We're going to play a game of Pong. You form the left paddle. And people just did it by looking at the screen. You know, they just sort of improvised and filled it in, and there was the paddle, and then we made a paddle on the right. And then the instruction was form a ball and send it back and forth. And people were doing it, flipping these things around with the feedback from the screen, guiding them. So it's all like improvised. That was what was so crazy about it.
And then, were there ever 2 balls or like half balls flying around?
No, there was just one. I mean, it was mushy at first because people would start one up and then it would dissolve because somebody would see that there was a stronger one there. But after people had played around with it for a while, it got pretty crisp. There must be video somewhere. It's worth looking at. Yeah.
I was hoping you could comment on the influence of open source on symbiogenesis and technology.
Wow. I would think I would think that it would be really facilitative, right? If you're using open source code, it's going to be easier to create these Frankenstein beings that merge than if you're bringing things together that are built in different languages. So I would imagine it would accelerate our ability to do such things. And probably if somebody looked at it right now, you could see that. What do you think? Yeah. Oh, good. I got the right answer. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering about the comment you made about cognitive distance. So the scientists were using the same data sets. One was on a pad, or like an iPad or something, and the other one was through a VR viewer.
Augmented reality. Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
augmented reality viewer. So could you talk a little bit about how you look at that space of cognitive distance through various interfaces?
Wow, that's just such the best example.
I mean, are there categories? I mean, is there hot or cold, or, you know?
Are you talking McLuhan at me now?
Well, I was thinking McLuhan. I didn't want to bring it up yet.
I think I'm just trying to say that sometimes, you know, when the magic works, it's working. That if you don't have to lead the user through each transformation, transduction that happens in the path of something, maybe you don't have to, and maybe it's going to be more impactful if it arrives immediately at the census with fewer transforms in it. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish, obviously. If you were setting out to explain to these scientists how the data was getting there, right, you'd want them to be aware of each step in the path. But by taking away all of the little things they don't need to know about behind the curtain and presenting the data immediately on the scene, what happened was, I mean, some of these guys told Sean they felt the boundaries of their bodies dissolving. You know, they felt themselves to be one with the plants. I didn't say that part because it's kind of wild, but it's true. I mean, so the question is, what kind of response do you want to evoke in a person? And in the case, the reason I use that example is because at the same time it's informational, it's also profoundly emotional, maybe even spiritual, what's going on with these guys. Not unlike the responses botanists have to plants in the field when there was no technology at all. So the question of cognitive distance is, how much do you need to reveal about the steps that you went through to get to a certain thing? I guess that's how I'd describe it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yes?
So everything right now is being gamified.
I'm sorry, say again?
Everything is getting gamified right now. You're seeing game theory.
Oh, gamified.
Being applied to everything. Kind of curious what your take is on what the possible ramifications would be. Possibly moving forward in terms of maybe emergence or a new hinge.
Maybe. I'm not the audience for that. I really dislike it. I think it gets in the way. You know, as I said at IXD, I want to see my fucking calendar. You know, stop with the funny business. I don't know. I mean, there's a way in which gamifying something can make a task that might be unpleasant more palatable. It might make a person more efficient. I will say one thing. In my early experience at Atari, I was working with a game called Star Raiders. You're not old enough to remember it, but it is the best game ever. And you could steer this starship around, and there was the star field coming at you, the whole deal. And I interviewed a bunch of little kids playing that game about math principles. I was working on a piece for the Teachers Association and tried to get them to tell me what they understood about trajectory and acceleration. And these kids, no, I don't understand that. I'm clueless, you know, couldn't explain it to me, had no idea what it was. But when they stepped into that captain's seat, they executed on notions, very sophisticated notions of trajectory and acceleration in the persona of the guy driving the spaceship. And that was like miracle learning to me, that when you're asking a child or a grown-up to step into another persona, that what's available to be learned and what might surface about what we intuitively understand changes. And where I went with that exercise was to say that when a kid steps into a character, everything is hanging open, including their ethical category. You know, so if you don't design what falls in there, something's going to fall in there by default, and it's going to be your responsibility. I can remember the first time I played Star Raiders, I kept thinking, where's the negotiate button? You know, we are responsible. And a child makes themselves incredibly vulnerable. That's why they can do these magical things like know stuff they didn't know they knew, you know. But there's two sides to that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you, sort of with this idea of Gaian and universal design for experience moving forward into the future, do you have any experiences with cross-cultural interaction design and what that means? And I don't know what, I guess I'm just thinking about culture and how people react differently to, or with this sort of direct experience, do you get things that sort of transcend cultural boundaries?
I think that cultural difference is incredibly important. This notion of Gaia on the surface, or at least at its root, is a scientific idea. But it's an idea that was presaged by millennia of mythology in a variety of cultures all around the world. So it's an idea that's been around in our subconscious. Jung wrote about it. There's a way in which I think you could frame a collaborative project of a global scale appropriately for a lot of different cultures where we might find ourselves collaborating in that magical, transcendent way that we didn't know we could. That's a hope. But I think the narrative that you wrap around it is maybe less important than representing what is actually going on to the senses. And then people make their own narratives. This is my narrative, you know, it's Lovelock's narrative. And if I were to build something, which I hope to do, it'll probably have traces of that, but I can see very easily sliding that over into an Australian narrative, you know. So yeah, there's sensitivity to be had, but I guess I'll have to say that because this trope has been around so long, no, it's not a trope, it's a meme, it's a prototypical idea, a protean idea that's been in human civilization for a very long time. So I worry less about the cultural relativity involved here than I would about finer points of science or technology. Yeah.
I think for the sake of time, you moved quickly over the project that had to do with sensing the breath. Can you speak about that project a little bit more?
Oh, it was great. There is a website devoted to it. The project is called Osmose, O-S-M-O-S-E, and the woman who designed it is named Shar Davies, and she is a scuba diver. So she decided that the way she was going to navigate the three-dimensional space was this breathing idea. And at the highest levels, you've got that forest I showed you with little sparkly beings that lead you around, and you can sort of drift by leaning into them. You can drift on currents with them. If you exhale a lot, you go down through a lot of levels, through soil and roots, and things get a little abstract, and then you get to the code. It's not really the code, but it's code. It looks like code. So you have this sense of like traversing the nature of the piece by moving up and down in it. But I think the way it was so, I mean, besides the art being amazingly beautiful, the breathing piece just automatically slowed participants down to the point that they were really open, you know, to transformative experience. I remember she told me when she installed it, that one of the mechanics that was helping her install it got in there and came out with tears running down his face, saying his life was changed, you know, so go figure. I mean, sometimes you just hit it. But breath, I mean, there isn't anything more primal for us. So I'd love to play around with that some more. Other questions, comments? Let's do one more and then be done. Yo.
So you had some really interesting reactions to the games from Purple Moon in terms of values. And connected to this idea of Gaian interaction design, where are values in their interface, and where is our responsibility as designers to be cognizant or to be manipulative of values?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I mean, I think to say that we are designing things that don't have values embedded in them is a fib. You know, I mean, even if you didn't really think about it, it's there. There are some kind of ethics represented in a piece. So I guess my take on the notion of Gaian IXD and the things I'd like to do next, one piece is strategic. It is to find ways through interaction design to help us individually and collectively so fall in love with this place that we can't bear to fuck it up anymore. You know? And the other goal, I guess, is to get clear about climate change and to figure out if there are strategies for collective action that we might take that will help us attenuate that, because it is staring us right in the face.
Awesome. Please join me in thanking Brenda for